like I mentioned in the previous lecture, minorities and the social aspect of history is really what my specialty is. So I feel kind of passionately about what was going on with the different groups of the American Revolution at the time. And so this whole clip will just primarily or only really be on what was the status of these different groups, women, African Americans, and Native Americans, what was going on with them at the time of the American Revolution. Okay, so we're first going to focus on Native Americans, okay? And actually, I'm going to bring this thing down here so you can see it a little bit better. But essentially, you can tell by what is written here in the Second Continental Congress, which is when they drafted the Declaration of Independence, what they really thought of Native Americans. Okay, so let's take a look at what that says. We desire you will hear and receive what we have now told you, and that you will open a good ear and listen to what we are going to say. This is a family quarrel between us and Old England. You Indians are not concerned in it. We don't wish you to take up the hatchet against the king's troops. We desire you to remain at home and not join on either side, but keep the hatchet buried deep. Okay, so the colonists were very concerned about the Native Americans joining the British. And remember that they wanted to settle in the land that was mainly Native American area. But they tried to keep good relations with the Iroquois, who were the only group that really helped them during the French and Indian War. And most of the Native American nations, though, really supported the British because of the fact that they felt that they would get more autonomy after it. Okay, while there were some, like the Iroquois, that still supported the British colonists, most of them were really supporting the British. They felt like they would get more out of that. Okay, so when it comes to, who did they side with during the war, that was really who they did. Now, after the war, when the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, of course, the Native Americans were not represented during that. They lose most of their land and they further lose autonomy. So things go from bad to worse for the Native American groups. Okay, one of the key people, I'm not going to embarrass myself by trying to pronounce his name, his Christian name was Joseph Brant. He served in the British Army as an interpreter and later moves to Great Britain, but he lost, and this is an image of him looking a little bit more white, and him in his traditional garb, and one of the more famous people that would help the British during the war. Now, women during the war, many women actually received a lot more autonomy. So the American Revolution turned out to be something pretty positive for women in general, okay, meaning that they could participate in things outside the home. For example, when we talked about in the last video, we talked about the Daughters of Liberty. Women could participate in various activities like in homespun goods and helping the Sons of Liberty with protests, with putting signs up. A lot of women run the farms while men are off fighting the war. And there are instances of women dressing up as men to, serve as spies. This is a very famous, and I'll talk about her when we get to that slide, but the image of Molly Pitcher, which was actually not a real person. It was like a conglomeration of fables that were kind of put together. Okay? But positively, on the positive side for women, most of them, after the war that is, women are held as important because they were seen as the key educators to the future, what we call Republican motherhood. So they're kind of elevated where women are important because they're educating the future. And so mothering becomes like this civic responsibility. And so that's how they kind of are able to actively engage in a public atmosphere. Negatively, though, women still don't have the right to vote. They're still denied all the way until 1920, which is 100 years this year. Some of the inheritance laws actually worsen, so women are left completely out. They had this thing called primogeniture that said that the first male heir would get all the land, and in a lot of states that actually gets worse after the Revolution. But most historians see the time period during the Revolution or after the Revolution as somewhat positive with women's rights. That's going to decline in the early 1800s, but for the most part, it kind of increases. And I'm a huge Abigail Adams fan. She was today really seen as one of our very first quote-unquote feminists, although I don't think that that label really applied during that time period. But she wrote a letter to her husband when he was on his way to the Second Continental Congress when they were writing the first Constitution, which is known as the Articles of Confederation, and she felt very compelled to address the issue that she wanted women to be part of this. And so this is what she writes in her very famous Remember the Ladies. I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire that you remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than in your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. In particular, care and attention is not paid to the ladies. We are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. Now, it's important to note, a lot of people criticize John Adams for not, for kind of like foo-fooing and ignoring her, though at least they felt like it was, but that's like putting their 21st century minds onto the situation. The fact that Abigail Adams could even have a voice to her husband to explain this shows you that he was a lot more liberal in his views in the role of a wife and everything, and he really was. But yeah, it was generally ignored, and obviously he kind of addressed it, but not really. But a lot of historians look back at this and see this as evidence that women really did want to have a voice, but they were just. And now we come to the women of the Revolution, some of the key figures. Molly Pitcher, as I talked about before, she was, most historians believe that this was just a legend, not an actual person, because most women during that time period would carry the way they would help out in a battle or in a group, in a battalion or something. They would carry water jugs to the troops. But theory has it that there were women that dropped when they saw men that were shot. In the legend, Molly Pitcher's husband was shot. She drops her water jug and picks up the cannon and begins to fight. Deborah Sampson, who was an actual person, and she wanted to serve in the war, but she couldn't, so she dressed up as a man so she could serve in the army. Mercy Otis Warren, who was a famous writer, and this is her here, and so she helped out by writing poetry, historian on the American Revolution, and then Phyllis Wheatley. This so you can see the information on Phyllis Wheatley, but essentially Wheatley is here, and she's going to touch both African Americans and women. And she was a patriot, an African American patriot and poet. She wrote on not only about the American Revolution, but also her internal conflicts with slavery, and kind of called America on that. And so she's going to be really key to a lot of the thinking that in a lot of the northern states that maybe this is a little hypocritical, that we're asking for freedom and we are enslaving people. Okay, so she'll be an important person there later on. Okay, and the last group that we'll talk about here are African Americans. Okay, and I'll focus on like during the war really first, because a lot of them served during the war. But so we have a lot of African Americans that serve on both sides of the war. First of all, it's important for you to note that a lot of them saw this and realized that if they could actually get help from the African Americans that were enslaved. And the Virginia governor, a man named Dunmore, issues a proclamation when war breaks out and offers freedom to African Americans that join the British. And interestingly enough, 10,000 of them do join the British for that, to earn their freedom. A lot of them died of smallpox, but the fact that this was issued, by the way, this makes a lot of people in Virginia very upset with the British. But there were other groups that served in the military too. In a very famous Rhode Island regiment, they were given emancipation if they served in the military. Now, note that that's more north. That's technically the middle colonies. Nobody's going to issue that in the South. And we're going to talk more and more as we grow about about how this kind of differentiates. And really after the American Revolution, we see the lines start to be drawn between the North and the South and then really begin to differentiate. Okay, so what was it like before the war and after the war for African Americans? Okay, so on a positive note, for African Americans, there were, like I mentioned before, there were states that began to recognize the need for African American freedom and saw the hypocrisy. So we begin to see states start to what's called gradual emancipation, and that is they instituted ways to gradually emancipate the slaves that were already slaves. The fact that they were defending the country, okay, that, after they won and they got that land that they wanted to, that proclamation line area, this gives America more room to expand slavery, so that would be a negative side. The other side is later on, as we grow development, the cotton gin will be created, and this, even though Eli Whitney had no intention of his invention actually expanding slavery, that's what ends up happening. And of course, people in the South, people in the North started to see the light and the hypocrisy. People in the South, it was too entrenched in their society and economically just way too important for them to do and willing to let go. Okay, and lastly, some important African Americans that had a role in the American Revolution. So Crispus Attucks, who we talked about in the last one, he was the very first person killed, casualty, and this is an image of him or a rendition of him that they believe that he looked like. But he was an escaped slave, half black, half Native American, first casualty of the American Revolution. Armistead, who is supposedly a double agent. He doesn't earn his freedom until long after the war, ironically, but he did serve on the Patriot side, and as we mentioned before, the very important Phillis Wheatley. So I hope that you guys enjoyed that little clip into how things changed for all these different groups. This will be an important PowerPoint because this is going to be a big push for me, is to make sure we hear about what happened to the other groups whose stories maybe haven't been told in American history. So anyway, we will see you all next week. We'll start talking about the paper. And like I said, this slide or this lecture and the last one will be important for you to be able to do that well. It's purely left out.